Last weekend, I had the privilege of attending our Universalist National Memorial Church's 250th Jubilee. It was a delayed celebration, as so many have been due to the pandemic, and we were marking the 250th anniversary in the fall of 2020 of John Murray's arrival on the shores of New Jersey and his preaching the first ever Universalist sermon that we know of in this country. Have you heard this story where a local farmer, yes, this is good, Thomas Potter, was convinced. He was convinced either through the still, small voice of all that he held holy, or perhaps from a longing so fierce that it held true for a full decade until his hope was realized that a Universalist preacher would soon come to his area and preach a Universalist word. Potter built an entire meeting house in anticipation of that person's arrival, so when John Murray, a Methodist minister, ousted from England for preaching Universalist sermons, was stranded on the shores near his home, Potter insisted that Murray must deliver this long-awaited word. Now, as UUs, we tell this story in many ways, right often as the one miracle story we will tolerate in our tradition. We share about how the very winds that blew Murray's boat off course in the first place held him there until Sunday and would not let up until he very reluctantly spoke to the religious teachings that had gotten him in trouble in the first place. Now, what I appreciate about this story, whether you consider it a miracle or not, is that he was adamant. He was determined that he would never again speak to his religious beliefs. He had every reason to resist doing so. He had lived through the loss of his family, his faith tradition, and an experience of debtor's prison. Murray was not looking to test the waters, as it were, by speaking against Calvinist messages or arguing that all souls would, of course, attain salvation. Now, to me, the miracle of this story is the impact of one person's testimony to a greater freedom, to that all-embracing love, and that his testimony had on the course of religious history in the United States. Right? This is the coming together of two individuals who were moved, yes, by the same values, but had really different life experiences, and the results of their improbable interactions with one another. Murray's was not the primary voice that spread universalism across the country. He's not our Johnny Appleseed, right? But his was the seed that planted at what is now Murray Grove in New Jersey and was carried from unclenched hand to unclenched hand until it rooted fully as a key center of our inherited tradition. Even today, we are discussing what it means for an unconditional love to live at the center of our faith. So it was not lost on me, as a range of Universalist and Unitarian Universalist ministers with interfaith organizers gathered last weekend, that we were celebrating a marking of our heritage on the very day that we learned about renewed violence and traumatic loss in Palestine and in Israel. At the forefront of my mind was the question, who are we called to be in these days? And how might our faith support us in what can feel like an impossible task? In our opening reading this morning, Atina O. Danner, who is a Unitarian Universalist writer of our most recent In Spirit collection of meditations and poems, she shares how she is called to sow seeds into every unclenched fist. My goodness, if we could open our hands and our spirits long enough to grow that which our spirits most desire. What would you plant this morning? Seeds of mercy, maybe? Seeds of justice? Seeds of a lasting peace? Danner talks about this gift of sharing as her sacred mandate to scatter seeds, she who was once a small child with questions about her own worth, she who now treasures the legacy bestowed upon her by teachers to offer witness that what we can do matters and that all of us have something good to share. This is language we likely recognize in less poetic form. We might say that the winds that held John Murray at the shore until he shared the good news about his value or his faith. You've almost certainly heard of faith by good works, or that idea that how we labor in support of our values deepens our understanding of our practice and helps us move ever closer to how we most long to show up in the world, in life and in living. Many liberal Christian traditions, including the ones we hail from, would call this everyday striving or this drawing on our values as to guide our living as a kind of discipleship. Now, for us, that is admittedly rarely a comfortable word, right? It's one that's more likely to inspire debates about who or what we think we are following, rather than reflecting on who and how we are called to be in community. But I really want a good word. This is the professor in me. I long for a good word that would reflect our vision of this knowing as you use. Right? In some sense, you can refer to that calling however you like. It can be meaning-making, living our values, moving through the world as bearers of love and justice. No matter the words, at its core is this ongoing invitation to become more than we would otherwise be outside of this tradition that we love, and to live our lives in service to that greater good that we teach about. Somewhere in the intersection of spiritual practice, theological engagement, lived ethics, our daily choices, exists a way of being that helps us to become better UUs over time, better in terms of communal engagement, faithful living, and this ever-deepening sense of self as part of a larger whole, right? Rather than that competitive individualism that too often becomes our habit. Perhaps we might understand ourselves as acorns instead, with so very much room for growth. As I've said in other spaces, discipleship at its heart is just the choice to practice Unitarian Universalism every day, to be open to how its teachings might change us, and to risk expanding what we know. We're not pledging ourselves to a single leader or teacher, not even me, right? Or even a particular rhetoric. Instead, we're opening to the possibility of how our common values work in us and on us. And we engage this risk-taking, justice-promoting, love-embracing tradition through that simple daily practice. Living by the covenant that our congregations and communities hold in common means resisting the habit of assuming that UUism reached its pinnacle the moment we arrived, right? When we committed ourselves to UU teachings. This is a very human reaction, right? The UUism that each one of us gifted to ourselves on that day, even if we were small children. However we understand or express our spiritual journeys, that UUism can't possibly be the best version of itself because it was missing the wisdom of every individual who found this community after we did. It was missing the witness of those and all we did not yet know. It needed more time for our scattered seeds to grow. So what if instead we become seed bearers for this liberal and liberating tradition? In this month, when your beloved congregation is deepening its sense of heritage, what would it look like to join the long line of teachers and preachers, educators and liturgists, rabble-rousers, the makers of good trouble, who plant the very values of this tradition in the unlikeliest places. I remember with real delight a colleague who shall remain nameless, but still serves in high levels of leadership in our tradition to this day, who used to leave their extra copies of the UU World magazine in hotel room nightstands next to the Bible and the Book of Mormon. They delighted in the idea that someone might learn of our tradition late in the night and be inspired by the witness we carry for the possibility of goodness in this world. I'm mindful of Unitarian and Universalist communities around the globe who found their way to their own expression of the values we hold dear by reading about them and building on the inspiration that came. The truth is, I believe that we grow ourselves from seed. I do. We've been shaped by a cultural expectation of freedom of belief, right? Which means we are more likely to leave our magazine in nightstands and laundromats than we are to pressure anyone to believe what we believe. We know ourselves to be people who freely choose to associate with one another and who take some moral responsibility for building communities where all might practice freely while yet holding fast to that common cause. So the part of me that is grateful for our free church tradition spends a good amount of time thinking about what it means to become a good ancestor. Right? In my role, I spend a lot of time tucking seeds in unlikely places. But the truth is that I too, in this embodiment, in this moment, I too am a seed. And so are all of you. Right? In the language of this morning's story, it's easy for me to look askance at an oak tree and pass it off as improbable. Some of us learn the power of ancestry through inherited cultural traditions that remind us of a greater strength that is passed generation to generation to generation. And I'm mindful that not all UUs have this sensibility in their family lives. And yet still, we are a people who cherish the ways that we are shaped and reshaped by everyday members of our communities. We literally grow ourselves from seed. So for me, one of the questions about discipleship or living our Unitarian Universalism every day, or even the good works that we do to nurture and support our communities, is what are we planting for those who are yet to come? What do you want your children's 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 children to benefit from in this faith? This wrestling about how to understand how best to live as UUs in the world takes on an interesting shape in our more recent Universalist writings. I know often when we talk about our religious heritage, we root ourselves in the 1700s, like we do when we talk about Murray and Potter, more often than we consider what our beloveds are gifting us in community today. But I've been intrigued lately by a more recent strand of thinking that essentially says the universalism that lives at our theological center, right? This is the radical, all-embracing love I mentioned earlier, that it struggles to define itself sometimes because we already won the theological culture wars in this country. I was surprised, although like me, you might not be shocked to hear UUs describe ourselves as the winners of a moral debate, right? But hear me out on this. The Reverend Gordon McKeeman, in a keynote address to the New York State Convention of Universalists in 1980, still history, but way more recent than the late 1700s, right? So in 1980, he spoke about a basic understanding of universalism that insists on the wholeness and the holiness that is found in all of life. Does this feel familiar? Wholeness, holiness, all of life. He told us that this focus on wholeness has been adopted in most liberal religious traditions and in the discipline of psychology, making basic universalist teachings a lot less urgent and less popular than when they were a radical countercultural claim in our society. right? He feels that our current universalist strand asks more of us, that it demands that we engage in a kind of spiritual labor to understand ourselves as whole, no matter what. And this inner knowing to McKeeman, not simply to believe in equality and goodness in general, but to work on ourselves in community until we know ourselves whole, is the urgent work of religious life. According to him, this is the universalism that persists. And it can be easy to dismiss his knowing as the same cultural individualism that we try to resist, but I think he was speaking to something else. So his colleague, the Reverend Richard S. Gilbert, known to many of us as Dick Gilbert, offered that same keynote address just 3 years later. Gilbert was also trying to define a universalism that had a lasting impact, right, on our lives and our living, and he was asking his questions through our emphasis on universal salvation, right? Essentially the promise that all souls are already saved. We might think of that as a certain kind of wholeness. But unlike many universalist writers who feel they have to defend this position, right, to convince us that somehow we are already saved, Gilbert criticizes it. He says it's too easy as a theological argument because it asks very little of us. He sums it up as the idea of a loving God who will save all of us, though, it might be nice if we also pursue goodness in our living. Right, so instead, he calls for an ethical universalism where every one of us works for the salvation of everyone. He says, universal salvation now comes to mean global solidarity. The unit for salvation is no longer the individual. It is the world community. So here we are, humble seed bearers who remain in community by our free choosing and by our trust in one another. Right here we are, simple acorns who have been told we are oak trees at our core, and we've been invited to know not just ourselves, but to know the world community as whole. And we've been charged to work for salvation in this lifetime, on this earth, in a way that proclaims every person, and I would add every being, as worth saving. And still there are atrocities happening every day that witness to the ease with which we can hold humanity as expendable. So how are we called to be bearers of love and justice in the world as we find it today? And what might we choose to draw on from our beloved tradition to help with that good work? See, I believe fiercely in the human goodness that we teach and preach about, even when our world and human history tries to tell me that that belief is naive. The goodness is worth working for. It's worth the struggles and the resolution of differences and even the moments of despair. It is worth holding at the center, even when it takes stormy winds to keep us on the banks of New Jersey until we preach a long-awaited word. So I want to invite you to hold those seeds as holy with me. And I want to thank you all for the ways that this community shows up in the world. Thank you for being a sanctuary and an anchor for those who would take up common cause for the work of liberation, especially in challenging times. Know that when the work itself is difficult, that an entire extended community of UUs is laboring, seed planting, and holding tender hearts together with yours. Know that you are never alone. May the seeds we plant together bear fruit beyond our imagining. And in community, may we give them the freedom